Very good. Sometimes I wish such videos could move very slowly so that the numbers and those benefits get digested and enter into the bloodstream and we all begin to speak and talk about those numbers. Because you hear the good numbers, but then what happens on the ground sometimes is not exactly what one would expect. A lot of this has so far been communicated in English, but would like to inform you that there are translation services available, and for those that might require translation, please just put up your hand and you'll be facilitated to follow the proceedings. I would now like to invite the Deputy Chair of the Council of TradeMark East Africa, Madame Lisa Walker, to come and make a few remarks. Lisa, please.
Good morning, everyone. Cabinet Secretary Betty Maina, Ministry of Industrialization, Trade and Cooperatives for the Government of Kenya. Stephen Karingi, Director, Regional Integration and Trade for the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and Mama Kita, Director, UN Economic Commission for Africa's Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa Trade, our partners, ministers, African Union officials, EAC officials, fellow development partners, and ladies and gentlemen. I'm pleased to be here today as a representative of TradeMark East Africa's Donor Council and one of Temea's 10 investors. The U.S. Agency for International Development has supported Temea since 2014 as part of our regional trade and integration portfolio. We've seen the effectiveness of Temea's model working both the regional and national levels to build momentum for change. It's exciting to see momentum now building for connectivity beyond the regional level. We're pleased to learn last year that Temea was planning a long-term partnership with the UN Economic Commission for Africa to support the creation of a unified market under the African Continental Free Trade Area in East Africa. I think I can speak for all of Temea's investors, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, the EU, Finland, Ireland, the Netherlands, and Norway, when I welcome the important product of this partnership in this report that we launched today. And also when I commend the UN, ECA, and Temea for the excellent research work that went into it. It's great to see so many key players in the room today. It will take champions from many sides to achieve the vision of a continental trade agreement. We have high-level national government officials from several countries here demonstrating important national-level commitment to move this agreement forward. We have officials here today from the East African Community and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and those already making regional connections for trade and investment with much to share and contribute to the continental vision. And importantly, we have businesses in the conversation today, highlighting the critical private sector voice in policy development. We as development partners and as trade and investment partners with Africa are also excited by the momentum to create a single market for goods and services with free movement of businesses, persons, and investments. Speaking from a USAID perspective, a continental free trade area will be invaluable to achieving our goal of doubling two-way trade and investment with African countries under our Prosper Africa initiative. We also appreciate that AFCFTA promises not only positive economic opportunities, but also positive socioeconomic and development outcomes. As emphasized in the report, there are significant opportunities through increased trade and investment to spur industrial development, which is so critical for job creation. We all know that large and growing youth population on the continent presents an enormous demand for jobs. In terms of gender empowerment, alongside the opportunity to shape gender-sensitive policies from the beginning, other parts of the free trade area have the potential to have a positive impact on female employment. For example, countries will be able to prioritize sectors for liberalizing trade in services and can therefore select those services that create more employment opportunities for women. AFCFTA can also create opportunities for gender equality and women's empowerment in the agricultural sector through expanded markets for exports and opportunities for women to integrate into agricultural regional value chains and value-added agro-processing. This agreement is all about critical connectivity that will boost trade. That means infrastructure connectivity, policy connectivity, and connectivity across all sectors of the economy as represented by the people in this room. TMEA has developed a strong track record over the last 10 years in East Africa, which has led to significant reductions in time and cost to trade and greater integration within the region. Armed with the valuable evidence in this report, we believe that TMEA and UNECA are well placed to continue their support to the implementation process. As TMEA's investors, we continue to support all stakeholders to connect the continent and grow prosperity through trade and investment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Before I invite our next speaker, please allow me to make a few additional recognitions here, especially the representatives from the private sector. We have with us, ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Peter Matuki, Executive Director of the East African Business Council. We also have with us Mr. Godfrey Simbeye, Executive Director of the Tanzania Private Sector Federation. And finally, Mr. Maxwell Okello, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Chamber of Commerce. I would now like to invite Mr. Rastus Mwencha, Board Chairman of the TradeMark East Africa.
Thank you very much, Richard, for the excellent job that you are doing this morning. And may I also thank my Council Chair, Lisa, for your statement that raises very important and fundamental issues, but also for the role that the Council and the partners of TradeMark East Africa have done in putting together such a wonderful project of TradeMark. I begin, first of all, by recognizing and appreciating the presence of many distinguished personalities, but allow me to single out my dear sister, Minister Betty Maina, and congratulate her on our appointment. I have a lot to say about it, but we happen to come from the same kind of world. She was in the private sector, pushing from the private sector about industrialization, and that's a sector I worked for quite a long time. I come from actually the industry sector, though people associate me with trade, but my foundation when I started my career was in industry. And so Betty and I have that convergence, and I'm so happy to see, and we are ready to continue to work and support you in that great portfolio. May I also recognize the many ministers who are here. I saw ministers from Somaliland, and our dear brother who was with us in Mombasa the other day, the other ministers, the minister from Burundi, who I also work for in one way or another, in the private sector in there, and the distinguished personalities were here. I had Tanzania, my brother, who is also a fellow board member in Africa Capacity Building Foundation, is here, and all the private sector that are here, just simply to recognize and appreciate your coming. I can only simply say, Karibuni Nairobi, and you're most welcome. But I want to recognize one fellow here who probably people don't know much, and that is Stephen Karingi, Director, Trade and Regional Cooperation, Integration, Economic Commission for Africa. Steve is one of those people who helped us hold our hands in putting together the Continental Free Trade Area. And I'm so happy that he's in the room today, because Steve is not only an intellectual giant, but also has got eloquent capacity of communication and skills. So welcome, Steve, and thank you for this partnership. I was told there are colleagues of mine here, former colleagues that I haven't seen from AU. If you are there, please raise your hands, at least recognize you. Oh, my brother, thank you very much. Good to see you. And the others who are here. My role here, really, having listened to Lisa, is simply to say that when we signed this partnership last year with the ECA, we knew that we are getting on board with an institution that has got great technical capacity to support the AU in the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. But we also knew that they are acting as a think tank is a capacity that we needed, because for us, all that is where the rubber hits the ground, because the work that TradeMark has been doing on the ground, particularly in the area of trade facilitation, is extremely important. And bringing the two together only makes the Continental Free Trade Area visible and a reality. This morning I was asking our colleagues, particularly Steve from Addis, the state of preparedness for us to launch the Continental Free Trade Area in July. And from what I gather, as we speak, they are now negotiating on trading services. Probably we'll hear more from our representative, which means and a number of 1 or 2 countries have offered. There are regions which are ready. And so that excitement in the room that you can feel is real. We should be able to expect that we can roll out. But of course, let's not be oblivious to the fact that as much as this excitement is there, the challenge ahead is equally daunting. It is not going to be easy, right? And I speak as one who has been associated with rolling out of a free trade area. But that requires that you have dialogues as we are having today, but dialogues that are informed. And so the work that has been done, the report that we are launching today, is a tool that enables the dialogue to be informed, the policymakers to be informed, so that you can take informed decisions. In the clip that was put here, it talked about the potential for trade in the continent. There's no question about it. We all agree and we know that trade is one tool that we have in the world for technology transfer, for industrialization, for poverty, and also for inclusiveness if properly managed. And I think we all know and we all appreciate that that can only be done if we have capacities to be able to come together as various segments in the community, the private sector, the public sector, and the other aspects like what we are doing in this room that can help you to make that information and also make informed decisions. But as we discuss about trade, a lot of us always think in terms of, well, trade is about tariffs and non-tariff barriers. And indeed, it's true. And talking about non-tariff barriers, actually, the non-tariff barriers are partly our mindset that we can change and believe that we can do it. That let's remove all these pessimism in us and move forward, just like we are doing. And so the first barrier is us. And so as we move forward, let's simply say we can do it, and we will do it, and we'll move forward. But as we move forward, we also know that there are real challenges on the ground. One of them, of course, Africa being big as it is, large from Cape Town to Cairo, with poor infrastructure, it's so difficult to move goods around across borders. And that is a reality. But also, the other challenge is that we don't have the basic instruments that make trade happen. Automation, having this one border post so that you can reduce the cost of doing business. And that's where TradeMark comes in. And that's where we come in to help this. I see this. In fact, when we were signing, as we signed agreement with this year, we also signed a cooperation agreement with AU not too long ago, a few months ago. It was clear that the AU is looking forward to TradeMark being the pace setter. If this region, and I believe what is going to come out shouldn't change so much what we have already in frame, if this region can move forward in what we are doing, then the rest of Africa will see a light and will be able to come along. We are not going to extend TradeMark and do TradeMark in West Africa. But West Africa, I'm sure sooner or later will have a similar. In fact, that's what they were requesting, that they will do one, because they know what TradeMark is able to do. And so I urge you, especially those that represent policy, those of you who come from the private sector, let's remove the non-tariff barrier that is in our mind of not believing in ourselves, believing in Africa, that we can do it and move forward. And the technical energy support to give you this tailwind is there, and that we look at the big prize. The big prize, we need to create jobs, we need to transform our economies, but above all, we also need balanced growth. And in this conversation, we must always think about how we integrate women, how we ensure that our growth also is balanced regionally. So I look forward to that discussion that will take place, but above all, beyond this room, as we move forward to get Africa move on this road of development and growth for the sake of the continent, for the sake of the world, and for the sake of our future generations. Thank you very much, and look forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mwencha. Just one statement that you made. We can do it, and we will do it. I think that should be the tone, that should be the message. Before I invite our last speaker this morning, we're not at the end yet. It's just the last speaker in the remarks. I would like to recognize also the presence here of Mr. Richard Muteti, the Chief Executive of the Small and Medium Enterprise Association of East Africa. These are really the people who are going to carry the goods, whether by truck or by wheelbarrow or by their heads, to move the goods across the border. I would now like to invite Mr. Stephen Karingi, the Director for Regional Integration and Trade at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa.
Good morning, everyone. So let me also start by recognizing the presence of our CES for Trade, Industrialization and Cooperatives, Ms. Betty Minor, and also recognizing the other ministers from within the region who are here present. I would also want to recognize His Excellency Erastus Mwencha. We always remember him because of the role that he played as the deputy chairperson of the African Union when all this was happening. I would also want to recognize the leadership, both council and board of the TradeMark East Africa, our colleagues who we work with on the AU agenda from the African Union Commission and also from the regional economic communities. And of course, I would also want to recognize my colleague director, Mama Keita, who is the new director for the ECA in the sub-region, and also my colleague, Andy Mould, who did a great job holding the fort in that office and was very instrumental into the realization of the partnership with TradeMark East Africa. But even before I concentrate on my statement, I wanted to say something about CS Betty, because we were very excited when she was nominated to be the Minister for Trade and Industry. Mr. Mwencha has talked about the role that they played together when she was at the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. But I would want to remember the first time I met Betty. You were the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs, and she actually the one who really fostered the dialogue between the civil society, the public, and the government, especially through the budget-making process, something that Kenya continues to benefit from today. Those of you who know the discussions that take place when this country is making its budget, it was actually Betty, when she was the director for the Institute of Economic Affairs, that fostered this dialogue, and it continues up to today. So it's something to celebrate. Now, as a minister, you now have the public policy, private sector, civil society. So we have a lot of expectations, but we are also there to support you. Yeah. Now, of course, Mr. Mwencha, you gave me the first break when you were in COMESA, when you believed in the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, and you allowed us to do the technical analysis of what it meant realizing the COMESA FTA and the COMESA Customs Union. And I think the knowledge that we found out of that work and the capacity that was built out of that work was very instrumental in the work that we have done under the African Continental Free Trade Area. So thank you very much. So let me thank TradeMark East Africa for co-hosting this important dialogue with us. This event wouldn't be as timely as it is now because the African governments, as we all know, are working towards implementing the AFCFTA. Now, this is a very landmark achievement for our continent. Those of you who have not followed the numbers, so we have the 54 countries that have signed. We have about 30 countries that have ratified, and the agreement is actually in force. And the plan is that we are going to have the first trading under the AFCFTA from the 1st of July 2020. Now, this agreement, unlike the other agreements that we have had within our region, that is in the different regional economic communities, the AFCFTA goes beyond trading goods and services to cover issues of intellectual property rights, competition policy, investments, and just last month, the leadership of the continent agreed that they are also going to have a third phase of the AFCFTA, which is going to focus on e-commerce. So you can already see the AFCFTA is not your classic free trade area as we have known them in Africa. Now, in the current global environment, which is marked by resurgence of protectionism in some parts of the world, the CFTA is going to open a new era of trade governance in our continent. It's going to provide governments with opportunities to undertake structural reforms in many countries that we hope are going to support diversification, trade, inclusive growth, and also help in the reduction of poverty. Now, the AFCFTA is also expected to benefit actors in all the sectors, especially women entrepreneurs and youth, through pathways towards formalization, especially for those who are operating in the informal sector. Now, Africa has made ambitious commitments both at the global and continental levels to achieve structural transformation and development through Agenda 2030 and Agenda 2063. The CFTA is expected to play a critical role in this development trajectory, and this is if Africa is to achieve inclusive growth and prosperity for the benefit of the African people. Now, you have heard the numbers, so I'm not going to repeat them, but the key thing is to know that when it is fully implemented, we are going to have one unified market of the continent with more than 1.2 billion people, and at current exchange rates, at an economy of more than 2.5 trillion, I think the numbers that you see on the slides that you saw on the slides were on purchasing power parity basis. We're also going to not only just have the removal of the tariffs, but also the non-tariff barriers, so that the trucks can actually be able to move, the services can actually be able to move easily across the continent. Now, the AFCFTA is also going to offer possibilities for businesses. In fact, the CFTA, we keep saying, it's actually for the private sector in this continent. But for those people who are in school, those people who go to our hospitals, the CFTA is also going to expand the tax base for governments to be able to mobilize additional resources. Because as you reduce the tariffs, businesses grow, then it's going to be much easier for us to finance our development, because we'll have a broader private sector that can also contribute to the kitty through the different ways of mobilizing resources. Now, according to some of the estimates that we have done at the ECA, we've done some simulations that look at the implementation of the CFTA for the next 20 years. We have found that the CFTA has the potential to increase the value of agricultural and food exports by 16.8 billion. Energy and mining exports will grow by about 9 billion, and industrial exports by about 43.3 billion. The largest percentage increases from these simulations, and now I'm talking about the continental simulation, the largest percentages increases, that is over 25% in intra-African exports of industrial sectors, are going to occur mainly in textiles, wearing apparel, leather, wood and paper, vehicle and transport, agro-foods such as milk and dairy products, sugar, beverages, vegetables, fruits, nuts, and rice. These are products or segments of value chains in which this region, the Eastern African countries, have comparative and competitive advantages at regional and continental level. So the AFCFTA is going to provide opportunities for countries in this region to reposition themselves on critical nodes of regional value chains for both goods and services. Now, you will all agree that from history, we have seen that the most important markets normally are from your neighbors. In the Eastern African region, countries already have a relatively well-developed framework for trading with their neighbors, but the AFCFTA is actually going to offer a bigger prize for this region. It's going to help scale up industrialization and trade beyond the sub-regional markets, and this is what the report that is going to be presented today has actually been able to reveal. Now, as expected, the expected benefits of the AFCFTA, like any other trade agreements, will not come automatically. And I think this is why we are actually having this dialogue. Its success will partly depend on the extent to which governments will set conducive business environment that enable the private sector to produce and trade in African markets. The private sector will also need to identify and prioritize opportunities for diversification and integration into regional value chains for both goods and services. A participatory approach is very critical. That's why I'm happy to hear that even the SMEs are represented here. This is going to be critical at the implementation and the monitoring phase of the AFCFTA. Regular consultations between public and private sector will remain critical for a successful implementation of the AFCFTA. Now, if you allow me, as CCA, one of the things that we are doing, which I would want to highlight here, is that we are actually working with individual governments, knowing that the AFCFTA is a continental agreement, but the implementation is actually going to be at the country level. So as we speak, we are working with about 14 African countries to develop what we are calling the national AFCFTA strategies. Now, one of the key things about these national AFCFTA strategies is to make sure that, first of all, the governments understand the macro environment within which they're implementing the AFCFTA. And secondly, we also want to ensure that you do not have countries making offers under the AFCFTA protocols that are going to break the regional value chains that are already taking place. Now, in simple terms, you know, countries have agreed to open up 97% of their trade. 3% of the trade is going to be what we call excluded from liberalization. Now, what you do not want to see is a situation whereby the 3% of tariffs that is not being opened up being one that makes it impossible for an already existing regional value chain between Kenya and Tanzania, Uganda and Rwanda, that not continuing. So through these national AFCFTA strategies, we are working with the governments to make sure that they foster the deepening of the regional value chains that are already in place. Now, the AFCFTA, the implementation of the AFCFTA will also need to be complemented by efforts of African economies towards addressing non-tariff barriers to trade, including both hard and soft infrastructure bottlenecks, trade facilitation measures, and rules of origins, among others. Some of the critical actions needed in these regards are discussed in some details in the joint report that is going to be launched today. And of course, all of us who know about TradeMark East Africa, we know this is an area that TradeMark East Africa actually has results to show. It's one thing to say what you're going to do, but it's another thing to be able to indicate through indicators of how the improvement of trade facilitation is taking place within the continent. And TMEA has actually been very successful in this region. Now, I cannot conclude without highlighting the issues of what the AFCFTA means in this digital age. Technology is a central element and is actually going to be key to unlock the AFCFTA potential. That's why we are so excited about the e-commerce protocol. Digital trade is likely to be a significant driver of increased levels of intra-African trade. Countries such as Rwanda and Kenya today use electronic commerce channels for the processing and delivery of goods and services. The private sector uses proprietary channels, marketplaces, and social media platforms to engage with market opportunities. However, impediments remain in the form of the high cost of cross-border payments, preference for cash payments, inadequate ICT infrastructure and logistics, and gaps in protection of consumers. These are all to be addressed in an integrated way for Africa to optimize the benefits of the AFCFTA and provide jobs and business opportunities to those involved in digital economies, especially the youth. For other groups such as women, it is important to ensure that discrimination, inequalities, and barriers are not replicated in the digital realm. Now, at this juncture, it's also good for the private sector agents who are here to know that, again, last summit, the African leadership endorsed what we call the digital transformation strategy for the continent. One of the key pillars of the digital transformation strategy that was developed jointly between the African Union Commission and the ECA is actually the digital trade and the digital economy. And this was done because of the realization that we cannot be able to optimize on the AFCFTA unless we are able to trade with each other. And the digital trade and digital economy is going to be key for the realization of the CFTA. Now, for us as ECA, we have committed to support the African Union and its member states to make the AFCFTA a reality for the continent, working closely with technical and financial partners And here I would want to single out Canada, European Union, Denmark, who are working very closely with us. Of course, DFID, who were very instrumental during the early stages in our work in ECA. The critical areas of interventions by ECA from the short-term to medium-term remains building consensus and capacity around the AFCFTA at national and regional levels to ensure buy-in of all stakeholders, supporting countries to develop clear roadmaps for AFCFTA implementation, and also producing monitoring tools such as the AFCFTA Country Business Index that we are currently developing, which will capture private sector opinion on the implementation of the agreement. So this is what we are doing as the ECA, and we want to really appreciate the partnership that we are having with TradeMark East Africa, and we hope that the lessons from this region is lessons that can actually be able to catalyze similar actions in Central Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and also Southern Africa. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Karingi. We're now going to listen to a presentation by Andrew Mould, UNECA's Chief of Regional Integration and AF, the African Continental Free Trade Area Cluster, in the Office for Eastern Africa. And as he prepares himself to make the presentation, please allow me to recognize the presence here of Mr. Fred Seka, the President of FIAFA, the Federation for East African Freight Forwarders Association. They will be moving the goods, and we'll need their resolve here that they will actually move the goods. Mr. Paul Koi, President of the Tanzania Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and Agriculture. Ms. Jacqueline Maleko, Chairperson of the Tanzania Women Chamber of Commerce. We also have Mr. Martin Bolen, the EU Trade Councillor in Kenya. And of course, we have a big delegation from the Ethiopian Chamber of Commerce. We also have a big delegation from the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think those are the countries that I hadn't mentioned. I will now invite Andrew to come and make the presentation.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, honourable ministers, distinguished visitors and guests, ladies and gentlemen. We didn't test the microphone earlier, so is that okay? Can you hear me? Okay. Habari za asubuhi. The microphone as well. I've got a mic on here. Yeah, it should be audible for the translators, yeah? Okay, habari za asubuhi. While my colleague Anthony is just fixing the presentation itself. Yeah, okay. While my colleague is just setting up the presentation, I'd just like to say a few words about this report. This has been joint work that we carried out with TradeMark over the last year. We felt it was very important to have a regional report talking more expressly about the situation for East Africa with regard to progress on the African Continental Free Trade Area. So the report contains some simulation work to try and portray the benefits for the region, for Eastern Africa, from the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. And it also carries some discussion about what the next steps need to be in terms of moving forward with this very ambitious and very important agenda. So I'm going to produce give a quick presentation which is going to summarize some of the key results from that report. Then Anthony and myself may answer some questions if you have about the presentation itself. I think the conversations you need to leave really to the eminent panel discussion that will come after that. And then Anthony's going to explain what TradeMark is going to be doing in terms of actual implementation of the agreement and supporting member states and RECs in the region. So, with that, let me take you very quickly through some key findings of our report. The first thing, the importance of the AFCFTA for Eastern Africa. Eastern Africa is a dynamic, fast-growing region. Ever since the global financial crisis, actually global economic growth has not been particularly strong since the 2008-2009 period. Oh, yes, I can see the screen myself. Okay. Here you see the global average growth. You see African continent doing better than the global average in some years. But I think particularly impressive is the rate of economic growth that we see for Eastern Africa. Eastern Africa, that despite being a region of low per capita incomes, has been one of the most dynamic regions in the world over the last decade or so. Indeed, we have 3 of the fastest 10 growing economies in the world currently in this Eastern Africa region. So it's a very dynamic economic region. However, I think everybody would recognize it's also quite a vulnerable region. There are some macroeconomic vulnerabilities. There are vulnerabilities coming from the global economic situation in terms of sensitivity, for example, to commodity crisis like the current one we see with the coronavirus, those kind of vulnerabilities. There are some fiscal vulnerabilities in the region where some countries have quite high debt levels now. There are environmental problems. We're all, I think, very sensitive to the problems of climate change in Eastern Africa with the dramatic changes we're seeing in the climate in the region. But with this presentation, and particularly with regards to the African Continental Free Trade Area, I'd like to focus on 2 vulnerabilities in the region, setting the scene. The structural vulnerabilities and the vulnerabilities in terms of employment creation, which was discussed by my colleagues in their introductory remarks. So, yeah. Yeah, I'm afraid, Richard, I do like to move around a little bit while I'm presenting so I can see my own slides as well. Okay, I'll speak from here as well. Right, in terms of the structural transformation vulnerabilities in the region, as you're all aware, it's an ambition of all countries in the region to diversify their economies into higher value added manufacturing and services out of the primary sector. We've seen certainly a shift in regional economies towards the service sector over recent years. Here, for example, over the last decade, you see the trends for Burundi, for Uganda and Rwanda. You see that they've moved into services, but you also see that there's been no shift in manufacturing. Manufacturing is on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis we have services trade, services GDP. And you can appreciate very much that there's been a stagnation in manufacturing, while there has been somewhat of a shift towards services. Yeah, that is not exactly what we would like to see. We would like to see a shift upwards to the top right-hand corner, where we're seeing increased value added in manufacturing and services. And in a couple of cases in this region, you actually see the inverse relation, where in Kenya and Tanzania, you've seen a decline in both manufacturing value added share and services share. Now, each has its own particular explanation. In the case of Tanzania, it's because of its mineral exports have taken a greater protagonism over the last decade. In the case of Kenya, because it's had some success, for example, in horticultural exports. But globally, we see that for the region, it's not really the pattern of growth that we would like to be seeing. We'd like to see a more accelerated shift towards high value-added services and manufactured goods. So that's one constraint. The other constraint, which was also mentioned earlier, is simply the demands of job creation in the region. Eastern Africa has some high demographic pressures, and there's a lot of additional people coming onto the workforce. If you recall from the video which we showed in the introduction, Ethiopia alone is adding more than 2 million people to its labour force every single year because of those demographic pressures. And in a number of other countries in the region, it's very high. In fact, in the those 5 largest countries there, they're adding 7 million people to the labour market every single year because of young people coming into the job market. So that's an incredible pressure on the regional economies to create that many jobs. And finally, in this introductory part, I'd just like to point to 2 stylized facts about both intra-regional trade and investment. In the East Africa community, since its formation in 2000, we see that it did very successfully in the first decade or so of its formation in terms of increasing intra-regional trade. There was a very sharp increase in intra-regional trade. However, what we've seen from about 2012, 2013 is a degree of stagnation in the growth of that intra-regional trade in absolute values. There was a recovery in 2018. The EAC figures show us that quite clearly, which is to be welcomed, but you can see that the general trend has not been as dynamic as it was in that initial period of the East Africa community. And this problem of stagnating intra-regional trade is not only a problem for the East Africa community, we also see it similarly in the other big regional bloc in our region, IGAD. So for example, there was quite a large increase in intra-regional trade in the IGAD region, right up to about the same period, around 2012, 2013, and then a subsequent stagnation. So trends in intra-regional trade are not necessarily going in the sense we would like to see. And unfortunately, we also see these patterns in intra-regional investment. Foreign direct investment in the region has been increasing quite markedly over the last decade or so. But intra-regional foreign direct investment, as you can appreciate here, has hardly changed and actually declined somewhat in 2017 within the East Africa community. If you look at it as a percentage share of the total, actually there's been quite a sharp decline. And in intra-regional investment, the region is less integrated than it is the level of intra-regional trade. Intra-regional trade stands at around 18, 19, 20% of EAC trade, total EAC trade. But in investment, we find that it's declined to as little as 2.5% of total investment is intra-regional. This all matters because this is what really makes an integrated economy, by high levels of intra-regional trade and investment together. Okay, so these are my opening remarks about some of the vulnerabilities in regional performance. I'd now like to move to a short section where I explain some of the untapped opportunities coming from the continental free trade area. And the first thing I think to stress is the size of the regional economy. Eastern Africa, as understood by our office, actually covers 14 countries. It's the wider Eastern Africa region. It's not just the East Africa community. And that represents a population of more than 420 million people and a market-sized GDP, market exchange rates of about 350 billion US dollars. Here are the figures for individual member states, with Kenya being the largest economy at market exchange rates. However, I think most economists would agree that for low-income countries, this doesn't actually reflect the purchasing power capacity of consumers in these countries. And you need to do an adjustment using purchasing power parity exchange rates. When we do that, you find that the regional economy is actually 2.6 times larger. So it's a very significant large market. In actual fact, on those grounds, we've calculated that by 2021, Eastern Africa collectively will reach more than 1 trillion US dollars. So a very substantial internal market. So it's fast growing, it's dynamic, it's consumption-led principally. Our research shows that consumption has been the main driver of growth. There have been increases in investment rates, but it's still essentially consumption-led. And it's a large market, potential market. Unfortunately, the degree to which regional firms are taking advantage of those opportunities, we believe should be much more evident. And you can see this, for example, in the trade performance collectively of the East Africa community. Over the last 2 decades, you have seen an increase in exports from the East Africa community. They have gone up very significantly over this period. This is in billions of US dollars. But you see also that imports have been more dynamic again, resulting in really quite large trade deficits for the region. And of course, this creates a financing issue and a sustainable issue for the long-term growth process. One of my colleagues had the very clever idea of actually breaking down the trade balances by products to see which were the sectors which were generating these deficits. And I think it's very illustrative when you look at this exercise. Food items, some countries in the region are net food importers, others are net exporters. There's not a very clear pattern there. Agricultural raw materials is practically balanced, a few net exporters. Fuels, we know the region is generally fuel import dependent. Minerals, we know the region also has a number of important commodity exporters. DRC, Tanzania is now become one as well. The real area which seems to be quite clearly generating these large-scale deficits is the manufacturing sector. As you can see, this is the trade balance by sector expressed as a percentage of GDP, and the red denotes the scale of those deficits. And it seems quite clear to us at the Economic Commission to Africa that this is one of the areas that needs to be addressed through the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, to give a real push to regional investment in manufacturing and increase that value-added share in the manufacturing industry. And that will help address the issue of these trade imbalances. And regional trade is actually very much fit for purpose in terms of helping address that balance. If you look at regional exports to outside the continent, you will find that the share of manufactured goods, processed goods, is actually quite small. Here it's the blue at the bottom. It's around 20%, just under 20% of regional goods to the rest of the world are processed. All the rest are still in primary commodities, unprocessed goods, minerals, and the like. But when you look at the East Africa community's intra-regional trade, the pattern is very different. There you find that around half of those traded goods are manufactured goods. So I think the argument there is quite clear. If you wish to change things going forward, you start to promote the intra-regional trade component. That is the way to generate more opportunities in manufacturing. Yeah. And the second point is actually when we've done some analysis based on the list of 500 largest firms across the African continent and looked at the firms in our sub-region, we see that levels of profitability in sectors is actually very high. So we've, for example, here you can see ICT, telecommunications, agribusiness, food and drink, food processing sectors, those kind of manufacturing sectors where the region actually is quite strong. You see that rates of return on investment is actually above 10%. So there are a lot of profitable opportunities out there. It just seems that currently it's not sufficiently regional firms that are taking advantage of those opportunities. So with that, I'd like to come to my final section, which is really to give you a summary of what's in the report in terms of our assessment of the African Continental Free Trade Area, specifically for the Eastern Africa region, because that was really the purpose of this report, to give some numbers, more detailed numbers for the member states and the regional economic communities in our regional bloc. The first gain, we did a computable general equilibrium model simulation. My colleague Stephen and his colleagues in Addis have been doing it at the continental level. Our numbers are fairly compatible between the two simulations that we did. We got welfare gains of about 1.8 billion for consumers in the region, principally through lower prices paid for a lot of the goods that they would be consuming. We also find a more than 1 billion boost to intra-regional exports from the region, 2 million additional new jobs, and other benefits coming from services and other labor-intensive manufacturing. Now, I should stress, when you get to look at the report, that our modelling assumptions were actually very conservative. We believe that these are vast underestimates of the true gains. Our modelling scenario basically involved removing tariffs on the intra-African trade component, but it did not include measures to reduce non-tariff barriers, which, as discussed this morning, was very, very key in terms of promoting greater regional trade, nor did it include trade facilitation measures. And in my final 2 slides, I'm going to make the point that that's the key to making this really happen, the Continental Free Trade Area. So those are the summary results, which you'll find in the report. Here is the sectoral breakdown of the kind of sectors which will benefit most. And you can see very clearly from this graphic, the leading sectors which will benefit will be processed foods, textiles and clothing, light manufacturing, heavy manufacturing even. Yeah? So it's definitely taken us in the right direction in terms of addressing this problem with the lack of structural transformation of the region. And a common comment is about, well, how much will this cost in terms of fiscal revenues forgone because of the tariffs which would have been eliminated on the intra-Africa trade. And I think for 2 reasons, policymakers should not be too concerned about this. Firstly, because over the last 2 or 3 decades, we've seen a sharp decline in dependence on trade tariffs anyway, and countries have diversified into other sources of revenue as well. So for those 2 reasons, I think a priori you wouldn't expect the fiscal impact to be very large. And our simulation result estimates show that to be the case. Okay, so as a percentage of total tariff revenue, because intra-regional trade is a small share of total trade still, you're not sacrificing much of your income. So you see for the case of Uganda, it's slightly higher because Uganda's actually got a larger dependence on the continental market than other countries in the Eastern Africa bloc, and I'll come back to that point just as I close as well. In the case of Kenya, we estimate approximate 3.2% loss of total tariff revenue, but that amounts to barely 0.6% of total government revenue. So we feel that this is a small price to pay for the added dynamism of the continental market going forward. And I wanted to actually complement those numbers, which are very, numbers that come from economists, to complement it with a few anecdotal examples of where we feel some of the benefits will come from the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. So, for example, in the labour market, IATA did a study where they talked about air service liberalisation across the continent over a group of 12 African countries, 3 which were in Eastern Africa. And they calculated that for those 3 countries, Ethiopia, Kenya and Uganda, air service liberalisation could add an additional 50,000 jobs. My colleague Stephen Karingi was talking about the digital market. There's a recent World Bank study which suggests that if we created an Eastern Africa digital market, that could create an additional 1.6 to 4.5 million jobs. These are really very large figures in terms of a complement beyond the figures that we'd estimated, this 2 million additional jobs. And also, as our video stressed, for companies in the region, often one of the leading constraints that they complain about when you look at World Bank enterprise surveys, for example, is the lack of skilled workers. Yeah? In the case of Tanzania, around 40% of firms complain that this is one of the leading obstacles to the expansion of their business, the lack of skilled workers. In the case of Kenya, it's around 1/3 of companies complain this is a major constraint. Implementing the Free Movement Protocol, which is very much part and parcel of the Continental Free Trade Area, would very much contribute to alleviating that problem. There's a lot of skilled people coming out of regional universities, but they're currently not in the country where they can necessarily use those skills. Yeah? So creating a continental labour market could very much benefit the region, we believe. A few more anecdotal examples, this time talking about energy and food security. Regional power pools. Ethiopia's made these massive investments in the Grand Renaissance Dam. Yeah? Regional power pools promise to bring down the power of energy for the sub-region by trading that across borders. Ethiopia itself, it's been estimated, could save as much as 20% of its fuel import bill by importing not from the Middle East as it currently does, but from neighbouring South Sudan. And I understand they've been exploring ways of doing this. Yeah? So taking a regional approach has a lot of cost advantages for regional businesses, firms, and for the regional economies. And finally, I think in this time of climate change, I think we're all very conscious of the need to improve food security, and one way to do that is through increased inter-regional trade. I don't know if you're aware of the trends. The Director General, we've been using your data set from the East Africa community very carefully. I was just looking at the breakdown for which countries have been doing best using this recently released EAC data set in terms of inter-regional trade in recent years. Tanzania's had a bit of a mixed performance. It was increasing quite well up to about 2012, 2013, where its growth of intra-regional EAC exports was the fastest for one period, but subsequently has declined somewhat. This is in billions of dollars. Kenya should, in principle, be the leading trader. You have 50% of the manufacturing capacity of the whole of the East Africa community. But again, you see the trend there has not been particularly strong. The big winner of intra-regional trade in recent years is not Kenya nor Tanzania, the two largest economies, but Uganda. Uganda actually in 2017 surpassed Kenya as the leading trader in the region. Yeah? And that reflects 60% of it is actually in food products. Yeah, so Uganda is really taking the situation there of being the food basket for the region, particularly in these times when we've had like the drought in 2016-17 here in Kenya. Yeah? So intra-regional trade in food items is also a very important way forward for the East Africa community. So I'd like to finalize my presentation with two slides just to emphasize the importance of not just simply sticking to the trade liberalization agenda of eliminating tariffs, but also these trade facilitation measures and non-tariff barriers issues. The first comes from a report which is about to be released by the World Bank, and it has welfare benefits for countries in the region using a simulation where they simply eliminate the tariffs on trade for the region. And you see that the welfare benefits are actually very small as a percentage share. But when the authors of this forthcoming study also simulated a 75% reduction in non-tariff barriers, this was the kind of results you get, much more substantial. And when they added on compliance with the WTO's trade facilitation agreement, then the benefits went up like that. So really, a massive step change in the benefits from complementing the negotiations on tariff liberalization with measures to tackle these long-standing NTBs and the trade facilitation measures to accompany it. And I think the final measure that I'm going to be the final slide I'm going to be showing makes this point as well. Another World Bank study, which I just became aware of, actually, looks at the time reduction in trade times due to different measures of trade facilitation. For Sub-Saharan Africa, for Latin America, East Asia, South Asia, Middle East and North Africa. And you can see that actually, for example, in terms of electronic systems, it's actually been doing better than the other regions, albeit from a low starting point because the disadvantage in trade cost times is quite high for Sub-Saharan Africa. So electronic systems have contributed a lot to reduction in trade times. So has customs administration support. This is the impact of infrastructure, improvements in physical infrastructure, and finally, risk-based inspections. So I think the point to drive home here is if you add electronic systems and customs administration, the kinds of trade facilitation measures which our partners, TradeMark, very much specialize in, they're as effective as these large-scale investments in infrastructure in terms of reducing trade time costs. I think it would be the right way of saying it. Yeah? So I think that was quite a powerful finding about the importance of trade facilitation measures really to bring home the benefits from the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. So I'd like to finish with 3 takeaways here. The first takeaway from our report is that East Africa needs deeper regional integration. It is a region which is not well integrated into the rest of the African economy, and even within itself. So for example, the low trade that you see between the 2 largest economies in the region, Ethiopia and Kenya, is not a natural state of affairs, and you would very much hope going forward the Continental Free Trade Area will help address that and help integrate East Africa as a bloc much better into the continental economy. That is the way we will get these regional value chains emerging. Yeah? So that's the first point. The second point is we believe very strongly that the AFCFTA should be seen as a catalyst for change. Regional integration is a long-standing goal across the African continent and very particularly in Eastern Africa. The East Africa community has achieved an enormous amount over this last 2 decades, but there's a lot more to do, and as you could see, the trends in regional trade over the last 4 or 5 years haven't been that encouraging. We believe that the AFCFTA is the way to give a new impetus, a new dynamism to these processes. It's not in conflict with existing plans of regional integration, whether they're COMESA, EAC or IGAD. It's actually to help these blocs more firmly integrate amongst themselves, yeah, and move towards this African continental market. So it's a catalyst for change. And finally, and a very, very important point which my colleague Anthony is going to elaborate on, is the need for this to be an inclusive process. As you may have noticed from my accent, I'm not originally from East Africa. I commonly make the joke I'm from the country which is probably least well qualified currently to talk about the benefits of regional integration. I'm originally a national of the United Kingdom. And in some sense, I feel I've been paying penitence for the errors of what I see as the errors of my compatriots. We've very much been very, very enthusiastic about this African Continental Free Trade Area process and regional integration in Eastern Africa. But one lesson I do take home actually from the UK experience is the importance of making sure that we take the general public with us on this journey of regional integration. If something like the AFCFTA with this degree of importance is left as a technocratic exercise and discussion, then I don't think it will succeed. And that's why it's very important to disseminate, to make sure that the general public is aware of the potential benefits, because they are the ultimate beneficiaries. Although we talk a lot about traders and the private sector, ultimately what we want to do is help the citizens of Eastern Africa improve their living standards. And we believe that the AFCFTA will be a very effective way of doing this. And I'd just like to finish my remarks by thanking our TradeMark colleagues for all the wonderful support they've done in setting up this event. And we're looking forward very much to continuing the collaboration going forward. There's a lot of work to be done on this Continental Free Trade Area for lots of institutions. We believe very much in collaboration. But I'd like to thank you all for your consideration here, for listening. And Anthony, I believe we agreed that we could take a few questions if you've got a few questions specifically on the presentation. Otherwise, we could move on to Anthony's presentation where he's going to outline what TradeMark is intending to do. And then you could leave your questions to the very distinguished, eminent panel that will come after the tea break. Should we do that way? Okay, so Anthony, over to you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. I'm standing between you and your tea break, so I'll try to be quick. Well, it's interesting that we are gathering here today to discuss CFTA, and I'm so happy. First, thanks to our UNECA colleagues and also to TradeMark leadership, Frank and our board chair and council chair. I think I'm privileged to speak on behalf of TradeMark. Thank you. So my job here is to essentially take you through what TradeMark is planning to do. So We were on the cloud, now we are coming back to the ground, okay? Because that's where TradeMark is very, very exceptional, okay? Are you all on the ground now? Because that was the cloud. We are now on the ground. Thank you. Well, so my presentation is actually structured in two broad areas. One is I want to focus, just as an extension of what Andrew presented, what are the priorities for CFTA, especially in our region. And then I want to build on the key takeaways and sort of give you a sense of TradeMark's CFTA implementation plan. And I'll bring out several examples of what we have done and what we are planning to do, okay? And then I'll conclude. So first of all, what are the priorities? Andrew tried to explain a little bit, Stephen Karinge explained also. Priorities are basically, from where we stand, we see 4 key areas that resonate with our work. One is lowering and elimination of tariffs. Tariffs is always an elephant in the room. We all know that. Businesses are here, they can attest to that. But also we want to address NTBs. How can we reduce NTBs and eventually, if we are lucky, to completely eliminate them? The most important element, which I think Andrew highlighted, even the World Bank report, IMF report that came out last year, they say trade facilitation is the most important hurdle for businesses for trade in developing countries. If we are able to address trade facilitation issues, by and large, we'll be able to help Africa significantly. And why trade facilitation is important? For key 2 reasons. One is poor trade logistics, okay? And second is trade infrastructure is still very weak. Well, in this region now, since TradeMark inception, we have seen a huge amount of change, and I'll try to take you through those changes. And finally, improvement in business competitiveness. How do we make private sector voice coming out? How do we engage the private sector to be able to be sitting on the same table with the government when policies are being made, when discussions are ongoing? So I'll start off with the key takeaways. The first key takeaway that Andrew alluded to is East Africa needs deeper integration. So the fundamental question to you is, what needs to be done for this integration to happen? Rather, if I'm to be selfish, what has TradeMark done? And what is TradeMark planning to do to actually make this integration deeper? Okay? So that's the question number 1 that we try to sort of address. We have done quite a lot of work in this region. One area that we have done to increase deeper integration is increase port efficiency. By increasing port efficiency, we have been able, and I'm focusing only on exports, time reduction, we have been able to reduce time for processing exports through our ports by half, from 15 days in 2010 to almost 6 days in 2017. That's a huge significant, okay? And you can actually see His Excellency President Uhuru signing, attesting that TradeMark is actually a giant in the room. We have been able to reduce border delays, and on average, that has come about 70% since 2010 to 2017, and we are still doing that work to make sure that those delays are addressed and they're in a sustainable manner. And you can actually see across different borders, we have supported the installation of infrastructure that is needed to actually make trade across borders seamless. We have built one-stop border points. We have built soft infrastructure of systems across borders. We have supported revenue authorities, and so on and so forth. There's so much. I'll probably spend the whole day talking about this only, out of many things that we do in this region. We have improved efficiency of trade environment. And key areas of trade environment, regulatory environment, are NTBs and standard and SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary measures. And TradeMark has worked significantly hard to make sure that these areas are addressed. And for that, for example, from Mombasa to Kigali, we have reduced transport costs that were coming from NTBs by 26%. We have reduced conformity to assessment and standards by 99%. I'm not hearing hands applauding TradeMarks. Thank you very much. So you see, we have done quite a lot of work on the ground to actually move things forward to make trade easy and effective. Now, let's move to the takeaway number 2. ACFTA is catalyst for change. Can you guess the question? The question is, how is TMEA planning to support the implementation of CFTA? What are we doing? What is coming up? Okay? Now, first of all, this beautiful photo shows what would happen if CFTA is really becoming mainstreamed. We are getting there. People are trading, coming from different countries, and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of, we have two phases in terms of what we're planning to execute CFTA. The first phase is phase one, which is quick wins, things that we call low-hanging fruits, that we can easily tap into and get things done because of our previous experience in the region. One area is trade policy. We want to harmonize national and regional trade policies. There are a lot of inconsistencies. Stephen Karing talked about the need for national strategies, so working together we can harmonize that. We need to enhance capacity of trade systems. Our systems were weak, but now with TradeMark in East Africa, we've been supporting revenue authorities to automate trade and make trade seamless. We want to eliminate NTBs. We have strengthened the reporting, resolution, and monitoring mechanisms of NTBs in the region, and we want to do more in that area. Most importantly, we want to engage private sector. We want private sector voice to come out and be part and parcel of the conversation in the policy dialogues. Most of the business sectors in the region are in the room, which signals our commitment to support private sector and make sure that their voices are heard and that policymakers, they can hear what private sector want, okay? What about priorities number two? These are interventions. Now, these are not quick wins. This would require some time to transition and for them to take effect. We want to enhance trade corridor performance. We've been supporting trade corridors, but we want to enhance their performance by providing basically soft infrastructure interventions on areas like ICT for trade and so on and so forth. UNECA, Stephen and Andrew, they alluded to digital economy. And TradeMark, we are not behind. We are actually on the frontier. One area we want to support the most is the digital trade corridors. So we are moving away not only from the physical infrastructure, we are also in the digital area where we want to improve interconnectivity of custom agencies, trade and transport agencies to support the implementation of CFTA. We want to also invest in trade information networks to make sure that there's transparency of information. Information is conveyed across stakeholders in the region, both the government and private sector and non-state actors as well. We want to enhance productive capacity. So one of the fundamental challenges within the African context, why we don't export more, is because of productive capacity. So we want to be able to enhance and boost productive capacity of African countries in the areas of value chains development, in the areas of trade and logistic clusters, and connect the production hubs. I'll talk a little bit about them shortly. And the final area that we want to prioritize to support CFTA implementation is the inclusive and sustainable empowerment of small traders. We want it to make inclusive. The last point that Andrew alluded to is CFTA can be inclusive, and we'll talk more about that shortly. Now, just to give you a sense of areas that we have done so far that mirror our support and our commitment to support CFTA. One, we have done interventions on customs. These are ICT for trade type of interventions. In Rwanda Revenue Authority, we supported the single window, which helps to process things faster. And what we have seen quickly, in 2014, for example, the clearance time fell from 11 days to 1 day. That's a huge, I'm pretty sure now it will be 1 hour. And the way I know Rwanda, how efficient it is, it will probably be 1 hour or 30 minutes. I don't have the stats yet, so I'm just extrapolating. And then in Uganda, custom management systems and Green Channel, we have seen 75% reduction in transit and clearance time. For traders in the room, they would appreciate this is exactly what they call elephants in the room in terms of business, and TradeMark is actually at the center to make sure that these hurdles are addressed so business becomes efficient and productive and profitable. Also, we have supported infrastructure in areas like Tanzania Food, Drug and Authority. In Kenya Tea Directorate, and you can see from the graph, our interventions have resulted to both time and cost reductions significantly. We are continuing to do that. We will continue to do that. And in the hope that these are the hurdles that we will need to make trade across countries much easier and seamless. Another important area that we are developing, and we are actually focusing on making sure we are working hard to develop trade logistic clusters. So here we have 4 key areas that we want to focus on. For those who are familiar with TLCs, if you remember the classic special economic zones, export processing zones, we are sort of having the similar structure but slightly better. And we are focusing on key areas. We want to develop facilities to attract investors and to facilitate trade. We want to promote investment of high value and goods and services. We want to create conducive environment for business to attract investment and to promote trade. And finally, forward and backward linkages between investors and local economy. All these are meant to do key goals. One is to spur industrialization and manufacturing in the region. Second is to create employment. We have 7 million people across the countries who are coming on the job market each year. How are we going to absorb that? So TradeMark has seen that as a potential challenge to the African governments, and we are working together to support that initiative. We have also a program on export capability. We want to, as I mentioned, one of the challenges in Africa is how much do we export out? One area that has been studied significantly is export capability, the productive capacity. So we want to improve that. We want to improve the capacity of our producers to focus on high-value sectors as opposed to the typical traditional primary commodities and sell them out. We also want to build their capacity in several areas. I'll focus on the 2, on how can they adhere to standards. And we have several examples to give here on the type of support we provide to countries to make sure that local exporters are able to meet standards that are required in other countries, even in foreign markets. We also provide support to link to logistics services and providers. How do they transport goods from one point to the other? Who should they talk to? Where can they get market information, and so on and so forth? TradeMark is working very closely with Apex organization in this region to support that process. Now, somebody talks about climate change. This is to say, again, TradeMark, we are on the frontier, and we really are now developing what we call green transport and logistic corridors. With trade, classically, with trade increasing, people have argued more trade, more climate issues, right? Because trade emissions and so on and so forth. So we are aware of that. And we are developing this green transport and logistic corridor to essentially try to address some of these for 2 key areas: to strengthen climate resilience on the corridors, to make sure that they are consistent with what is expected, and to reduce greenhouse emissions that could come about because of so many trucks and trade increasing over time. So we are trying to strike balance. As much as we want more trade to happen, at the same time, we want trade that is environmentally friendly and sustainable. Now, the last key takeaway. ACFTA needs to be inclusive. How can we make ACFTA inclusive? Okay? What plans do we have as TradeMark? How are we going to do it? Now, ACFTA can be inclusive. And I'm showing the photo here because we have a very specific program, actually 2, one that focuses on women in trade and one that focuses on gender-related issues and inclusive issues. And we are working tirelessly. So far, we have reached about 30,000 women, and we are targeting to reach out to 150,000 women in the course of Strategy 2. So that tells you we really want, TradeMark is already inclusive, number 1. So we just want to stretch a little bit more and make sure CFTA that we are supporting in terms of implementation is also inclusive twice as much, okay? Now, just quickly to give you a sense of what we are doing. So if you read CFTA Preamble Section 3, African countries have already committed to sort of develop strategies that are gender sensitive, that are related to including women and youth, okay? And in TradeMark, we have already systems in place where we target to strengthen women empowerment through public-private dialogue within AFCFTA. And we want to make sure that women traders and women-owned businesses are plugged into regional value chains. We have already started those programs in some countries, and we would like to do more to support CFTA implementation. Now, maybe too much wordy. Let's come back to numbers, okay? Now, on numbers, I just want to give you a sense of why supporting CFTA is critical for us, and especially in value chains. And I want to pick this graph again from the World Bank report that Andrew was talking about, where you can actually see on the x-axis, you have countries that are nationally focused firms, and the share of women labor that are hired in those sectors. And on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you have businesses that engage in global value chains. What is interesting to note here is that you will notice, except for Tanzania, which seems to have equal share, the other countries, if you are below the line, this is a 45-degree line. If you are below the line, that means you have more share of female labor for firms that are engaged in global value chains relative to those that are nationally focused. And you can actually see Uganda, Kenya, they are doing pretty well. If you look at Ethiopia, it's actually even better. They're engaging more women in global value chains relative to other countries in the region. And we want to support these kind of initiatives to make sure that businesses that are operating in the region, they actually engage and hire more women to the job market. Now, in terms of what we have done, we have focused quite a lot of work in Strategy 1, and we are still doing the same on cross-border trade in this region. And for those who are familiar and know the DG for EAC is here, they know cross-border challenges that women face. And these include harassment, lack of education to understand what are the rules, what are the things to do across the border when you're crossing the border clearance. Sometimes we have had studies that show there's harassment by cross-border officials and so on and so forth. And the percentages speak for themselves. But what we have done in TradeMark, that we have addressed these challenges for Strategy 1, and we have remarkable results to show, which we want to continue to execute as we march forwards towards CFTA implementation. And our interventions so far have shown that we have increased access to market and traditional trading information across borders, so women now are more informed. And recently we concluded a 4-country rapid needs assessment to understand what are the informational needs for women in this region and what are the different modes that they can be used to sort of communicate and reach out to women. That has increased transparency and accountability across borders. Women are now more aware of their rights, what to do, what not to do. In the process, it has increased export value by 27%, which is equivalent to $1.4 billion in new export businesses, because women now are able to trade more frequently across different export markets, which is my last bullet, that we have also increased in the process access to export markets, which are critical for ensuring that not only women are empowered, but they're able to trade and add value to their lives. Now, conclusions. So what do we see from all this? There are 3 key takeaways that I would like you to take home today. One is, we all agree, everything else remains constant. I'm an economist, so I prefer ceteris paribus principle because it saves you from all the other questions that would come, and I hope you won't ask me those questions. If implemented properly, CFTA can offer a new dawn for East African community, economies. It can significantly boost interregional trade by addressing both tariff and non-tariff issues, It can also move away from the vision now to action. And the action area, this is where TradeMark is particularly interested. We want to focus more on how can we implement this agreement, how can we make it possible for countries to benefit and realize these visions into action. And then there are opportunities, and TradeMark is ready to support these opportunities to support CFTA. We are ready to share our learnings. We've done quite a lot of work on trade facilitation in this region for the past 10 years. And we believe those are our stock to take forward on the lessons and how we can implement as we expand to other countries as well. And we are, most importantly, through our partnership with the African Union, we are more than ready to support the Boosting Inter-African Trade Action Plan, which is pretty much trade facilitation related measures that we have been doing in the past 10 years. With that, TradeMark is ready to translate the CFTA vision into action, and please take home that TradeMark is a willing partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Andrew and Anthony. Quite a few numbers to digest. I can tell you sometimes when the amount of money becomes too big, it kind of loses value instead. But we're talking about 1.8 billion welfare gains Can you imagine how much that is? 1 billion increase in intra-regional exports. So if we were to share the 1 billion amongst the countries that are here, I'm sure each country would walk away with about 300 or 400 million increase in exports. Doesn't that sound quite interesting? We'll shortly go for a break. But just before we do that, I would just want to let you know a few more people who are here. The purpose of this is that if you have to engage, if you have to network, please follow them up, make deals. That's the reason we need to begin capturing the 1 billion increase in exports today. So we have with us here a delegation from South Sudan led by the Honorable Momo Ethian, Under-Secretary for EAC Affairs in the Ministry of Trade and Industry. We also have Mr. Jamal Aidid, Chairman of the Chamber of Commerce of Somaliland. We have Mr. Musa Hassan, Chairman of the Quality Control Commission of Somaliland. Just to remind us that as we talk about increasing exports, they should be quality exports. So the Bureau for Standards is right here. We also have with us Mr. Nick Nesbitt, the Chairman for the East African Business Council. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just one small announcement. Just give me a minute. This is just the beginning of engagements on the African Continental Free Trade Area. So I've been requested to inform you that there will be the second Africa International Conference on Trade and Finance held at the African Union Commission, African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And this invitation to you, please take this as an invitation, and I'm sure it's strong enough to get your visa approved to Ethiopia. The invitation is from the Addis Chamber of Commerce and sectoral associations. We have a big team. If you need any more information, the team is right there. Just put up your hand yet if people need to know. Right there. So any further clarifications, please talk to them. So as we get ready now, we said this was a dialogue. To have the real dialogue, we'll have a panel here. But as we get ready for that, we'll have a short break. And short, please, as in short. I know we need to network. I would encourage you to network at lunch, over lunch. Kindly just step out and pick your cup of tea and come back with it. If you allow me, I will not seek your views, but I would like to give you 10 minutes. 10 minutes, please. Just pick your cup and get back to the room. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we have already consumed 2 minutes out of the 10. Kindly go and pick your cups of tea and get back to the room.
Hi, Lisa. How are you?